June 13, 1943. In the operations room of the Japanese Naval Air Base at Bougainville, on the southern coast of Bougainville, a group of Zero fighter pilots gathered around a table examining intelligence photographs of a new American aircraft. The plane in the images was distinctive. Twin engines mounted on twin tail booms, a central nacelle for the pilot, and a silhouette unlike anything in the conventional fighter design. A staff intelligence officer was briefing the pilots on this new threat, but the mood in the room wasn't one of concern. It was barely suppressed amusement. The aircraft was the Lockheed P-38 Lightning, and to the eyes of pilots trained in the elegant minimalism of Japanese fighter design, it looked absurd. One pilot, Lieutenant Commander Takeo Tanemizu, a veteran with 11 confirmed victories, picked up the photograph and studied it with a smile. He turned to his wingman and said something that would be recorded in the base diary that evening. "The Americans have built a fighter that looks like it's going in two directions at once. This will be easier than I thought." The room laughed. It was a moment of genuine confidence, not empty bravado, because these pilots had earned the right to their certainty. They flew the Mitsubishi A6M0, a fighter that had dominated Pacific skies for 18 months, destroying everything it encountered. They had studied American aircraft design and found it clumsy and over-engineered. And now the Americans had produced something that looked like a committee's compromise. A plane designed by people who couldn't decide what they wanted, so they built everything. The Japanese pilots returned to their quarters that evening, expecting the coming battles to reinforce what they already believed about American incompetence in aircraft design. Within 2 weeks, half of them would be dead, and the survivors would be filing reports that their commanders would initially refuse to believe. To understand their shock, you must first understand the supremacy the Zero had established and the philosophy that created it. When the Mitsubishi A6M entered service in 1940, it represented the purest expression of Japanese fighter doctrine: extreme lightness, radical maneuverability, and maximum range. Japanese engineers had stripped away everything unnecessary: armor protection, self-sealing fuel tanks, heavy guns, to create an aircraft that could outturn, outclimb, and outrange any fighter in the world. And for the first year of the Pacific War, it worked spectacularly. American pilots flying P-40s and F-4F Wildcats found themselves completely outmatched. The Zero could turn inside anything they flew, could climb away from any engagement, and could pursue them until fuel exhaustion forced the American planes down. Japanese pilots had good reason for their confidence. It was built on dozens of one-sided victories. When intelligence reports began arriving about the twin-engine fighter called the Lightning, Japanese tactical analysts studied the specifications and weren't concerned. The P-38 was big, too big in their assessment. It weighed more than twice as much as a Zero. It had 2 engines, which meant complexity, maintenance issues, and more things to break. And those twin tail booms looked like structural vulnerabilities, places where a Zero's 20mm cannon could shear off control surfaces with a single burst. The intelligence assessment filed in Tokyo concluded that the P-38 was probably designed as a bomber escort or long-range reconnaissance aircraft, not a true fighter. Japanese pilots were advised they might encounter it, but shouldn't consider it a serious dogfighting threat. This assessment was filed in May 1943, and it wasn't challenged for almost 6 weeks, not because it was classified, but because every pilot who discovered it was wrong, didn't survive to file a report. The first systematic encounter between Zeros and P-38s occurred over the Russell Islands on June 16, 1943, and the battle lasted less than 12 minutes. A formation of 16 Zeros, led by Lieutenant Commander Tanemizu, the same officer who had mocked the Lightning's appearance 3 days earlier, intercepted a group of 8 P-38s escorting American bombers. Tanemizu's tactical approach was textbook Zero doctrine: climb above the enemy, dive to attack, and use superior maneuverability to control the engagement. As his formation dove on the American fighters, Tanemizu was already planning his victory report. The P-38 saw them coming. That much was clear from their formation shift. And then the American planes did something that contradicted everything Tanemizu knew about heavy fighters. They accelerated. Not gradually, not in a desperate attempt to run, but explosively, pulling away from the diving Zeros as if his formation was standing still. Tanemizu pushed his throttle to maximum power, but the gap continued to widen. The P-38s didn't turn to fight. They didn't need to. They simply extended away, built separation, and then reversed the engagement on their own terms, coming back at the Japanese formation from a position of advantage. What happened next lasted 4 minutes and resulted in the destruction of 6 Zeros, including Tanemizu's wingman. Tanemizu himself survived by diving away and running for cloud cover, abandoning the fight entirely. When he landed back at Bin, his hands were shaking so badly that his ground crew thought he'd been wounded. He hadn't been touched. He'd been educated. What Tanemizu didn't know, what Japanese intelligence had failed to detect, was that the P-38 Lightning had been designed using a completely different philosophy of air combat, one that valued energy management over turning performance. American engineers, studying combat reports from Europe and China, had concluded that the tight-turning dogfight was an obsolete tactical concept if you had enough speed and climb rate to control engagement parameters. The P-38 couldn't outturn a Zero. It wasn't designed to. Instead, it could outrun, outclimb, and outdive the Zero, which meant Lightning pilots could choose when to fight and when to disengage. And that twin-engine configuration that looked so clumsy delivered something revolutionary: symmetric power. If one engine was damaged, the P-38 could still fly home. If both engines were running, it had surplus power that translated into speed and climb rate that no single-engine fighter could match at altitude. The twin-tail design wasn't a weakness. It was a solution to the torque and control problems that high-powered single-engine fighters struggled with. Every aspect of the plane that Japanese pilots had mocked as over-engineered turned out to be carefully reasoned engineering that solved problems they didn't know existed. The reports from the Russell Islands battle reached Japanese command that evening, and the initial response was disbelief. 6 Zeros lost to 8 P-38s with no confirmed American losses. There had to be an error, pilot confusion, misidentification, perhaps heavy flak that had been misattributed to American fighters. Orders went out for more data, and over the next 10 days, that data arrived in a flood of after-action reports that all told the same impossible story. The Lightning was faster. It climbed better. It dove better. And when Lightning pilots chose to fight, they had firepower concentrated in the nose: 4 50-caliber machine guns and 1 20mm cannon, all firing straight ahead with no convergence issues that could shred a Zero in a single burst. Japanese tactical doctrine had no answer for an opponent who refused to fight on Japanese terms. On June 30th, a classified meeting was convened at Rabaul's main air headquarters. Every squadron commander in the theater was required to attend, and the topic was singular: how do we fight the P-38? The discussion was recorded in meeting minutes that were recovered after the war, and they make for sobering reading. Officer after officer described the same tactical problem. Zero pilots would maneuver for a shot, and the Lightning would simply accelerate away before the Zero could close. If the Zero attempted to dive away to break contact, the Lightning would follow and overtake it in the dive. If the Zero attempted to climb away, the Lightning would match or exceed its climb rate above 15,000 feet. One squadron commander, Captain Yasuhiko Kuroe, spoke with unusual bluntness. "We have been teaching our pilots that maneuverability wins battles. The Americans have built a fighter that makes maneuverability irrelevant. It is faster than us in every regime of flight. What do we do against an opponent who can always run away and always catch us?" The senior officer present, a rear admiral whose name was redacted from the minutes, responded with a phrase that appeared in many Japanese tactical documents from mid-1943 onward: "Win quickly before they can disengage, or avoid combat entirely." This wasn't tactics, it was an admission that the Zero had been rendered obsolete by a design philosophy Japanese engineers hadn't anticipated. But the most devastating encounters were still ahead, and they would be terrifyingly personal. On April 18, 1943, 2 months before the Russell Islands battle, but not widely known until later, a P-38 mission had demonstrated exactly how lethal the Lightning could be in the hands of an expert pilot. American codebreakers had intercepted messages indicating that Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the architect of the Pearl Harbor attack and Japan's most revered naval strategist, would be flying in a bomber from Rabaul to Bougainville. A mission was hastily organized. 16 P-38s would fly more than 400 miles over open ocean, intercept Yamamoto's flight, and eliminate him. The mission required precision navigation over vast distances with no landmarks, exactly the kind of long-range operation the Lightning had been designed for. The Zeros escorting Yamamoto's bomber never had a chance. The P-38s appeared exactly on schedule, executed their attack in under 2 minutes, and disappeared before Japanese reinforcements could arrive. Admiral Yamamoto was killed, and the Zero pilots who survived filed reports expressing bewilderment at how the American planes had navigated so precisely and struck so quickly. One escort pilot wrote, "They came from nowhere, destroyed everything, and vanished. We never even saw them clearly. This is not how fighter combat works." Except it was how fighter combat worked now, and Japanese tactical thinking couldn't adapt quickly enough. The Zero had been designed for close range, turning battles where pilot skill and aircraft agility determined outcomes. The Lightning had been designed to avoid those battles entirely, to strike from advantage and disengage before retaliation was possible. It was a paradigm shift, and paradigm shifts in military technology are only obvious in hindsight. In the moment, they feel like the enemy is cheating, breaking rules that everyone understood. Japanese pilots began developing countermeasures, tighter formations, better altitude discipline, attempts to lure P-38s into slow-speed fights near the ground, but these were tactical adjustments to a strategic problem. The P-38 had changed what was possible in air combat, and no amount of training or bravery could overcome the simple mathematics of speed and energy. By August 1943, Japanese combat reports had stopped mocking the P-38's appearance. The aircraft now appeared in intelligence briefings with red flag warnings, and pilots were instructed to avoid engagement unless they had overwhelming numerical superiority and altitude advantage. Even then, losses continued. The Lightning force in the Pacific grew from dozens to hundreds, and everywhere they appeared, Japanese air superiority crumbled. The psychological impact was profound. Pilots who had been trained to believe their aircraft was superior now flew with the knowledge that every encounter with twin-tailed silhouettes might be their last. Combat effectiveness plummeted, not because Japanese pilots lost their courage, but because they lost their confidence in the tools they'd been given. In September 1943, a captured American P-38 pilot was interrogated at Rabaul, and the transcript includes an exchange that captures the cultural disconnect perfectly. A Japanese intelligence officer asked the American pilot why the P-38 had been designed with 2 engines and twin tails instead of following conventional single-engine fighter design. The American pilot, according to the translator, seemed confused by the question. He responded, "Because we wanted it to go fast, fly high, carry heavy guns, and bring pilots home. You need 2 engines for that. Why would you build it any other way?" The Japanese officer noted in the margin of the transcript, "Prisoner does not understand question. Seems unaware that his aircraft violates basic fighter design principles." The tragedy was that it was the Japanese officer who didn't understand. American engineers hadn't violated principles. They'd abandoned them in favor of a different set of priorities. And those priorities had been proven devastatingly correct. The P-38 Lightning would go on to account for more Japanese aircraft destroyed than any other Allied fighter in the Pacific theater. It would serve from the Aleutians to New Guinea, from bomber escort missions to ground attack, from high-altitude interception to low-level reconnaissance. But its most important contribution wasn't the planes it shot down, it was the doctrine it shattered. The Zero had taught Japanese pilots that lightness and maneuverability were supreme. The Lightning taught them that speed and energy dominance could trump maneuverability entirely. And when your entire tactical philosophy is built on assumptions that turn out to be wrong, no amount of bravery can save you. Lieutenant Commander Takeo Tanemizu survived the war, one of the few veteran Zero pilots to do so. In a 1958 interview with an aviation historian, he was asked if he'd been afraid during the war. His answer was precise. "I wasn't afraid of dying. I was afraid that we'd been lied to, not by our commanders, but by our assumptions. We believed our way of building fighters was the only correct way. The Americans showed us there were other ways, better ways, and we realized it too late to matter." That kind of fear stays with you. The fear that your certainty was just ignorance you didn't recognize yet. That twin-tailed fighter they'd mocked in June 1943 had done more than shoot them down. It had shot down their certainty, and that was a wound no armor could prevent.